Hey, thanks for having us. I'm really excited to be here with you all. We're doing this series, conversation series, like Monica said. Is this on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. And this is our first, so thanks for being at the kickoff. We'll be doing more of these here at PCC and around at other schools as well as part of our Keep Oregon Well in Schools initiative. So thanks for being here with us for the kickoff.
Logan, I'm so happy to be here having this conversation with you today in an interview form. So should we dive in?
Let's.
Great. So I'd love to ask you first, how did you become involved with mental and behavioral health?
Yeah, I mean, I as a child, was raised in a pretty conservative environment. I often call it a cult. It was in rural Nebraska and really small town, really not a great environment for somebody who was gay. I've been gay my whole life, and it was complicated early on. And when I was 7 years old, I was attacked by an adult in my life and was sexually abused from 7 to 9. And so I've been a consumer of mental and behavioral health care my whole life. From the time that I was injured till now, have a whole wellness plan. That is how I show up in rooms like this, how I show up in my life every day. And so I got into mental health because of my own struggles with mental illness.
And so your early childhood, you experienced some abuse, and then how did you kind of leave that life? How did you leave Nebraska?
Yeah. My reaction to that abuse was pretty instantaneous. I started self-medicating when I was 10. I was smoking and drinking and cocaine, and again with my situation, my life environment, it wasn't really conducive to me finding healing. It was largely about, like, what's wrong with this kid? Why is he acting this way? Let's pray for him, or like he must have a demon in him, or whatever. So nobody ever really zeroed in on the fact that I was hurting. Yeah. So I eventually, because of my own queerness and my own mental illness, my own struggles with addiction, I eventually left the church. I left my community, left my family, and the next 16 years I was actively addicted to cocaine and alcohol and crack cocaine. I was in and out of housing. I lived in really terrible environments, if I had a terrible environment to live in at all at any given time. So I struggled with chemical dependency. I struggled with being a person in the world, and that 16-year battle ended in 2008. I'm about to celebrate 10 years.
So you've done a tremendous amount of healing work.
Yeah.
Can you paint us a picture of what your healing journey has looked like?
Sure. I think healing journey for me, like that term, or even feeling connected to the fact that I'm on a healing journey, is largely retrospective, right? Like during the times when I was going in and out of rehab, or overdosing very publicly, or blowing opportunities, or whatever I was doing, every time somebody connected with me, every time somebody saw me in my struggle as well as in my humanity and helped me connect to my magic, that was part of that healing journey, right? It was like every time I saw my worth, every time I had that worth reflected back, I was able to strap that on my back as opposed to just this trauma, this traumatic experience, and the reenactment of trauma that I had going on for years.
And what role did music play?
Well, one of the ways early on that I knew I could get the poison out, I had all these really scary, you have a very fancy word for this that we were talking about in the pre-interview.
Alexithymia, no words
That's
for
the
feeling.
word, no words for feeling. So I had that going on where I just truly, I had this situation in my life, I knew I was suffering, and I had no way to talk about it. But I could write songs. I knew I could write songs. I was a DJ in the Midwest, here and there. And when I got to Portland, amidst that struggle of being a very young person in and out of housing and certainly experiencing drug addiction on the streets, I met some people. I met Elliott Smith, I met Dan Reed, I met Zia from the Dandy Warhols, Courtney Taylor from the Dandy Warhols, and those people heard my demo, and it led to me getting a record deal when I was 17 years old. the first of many. I had a tendency to sort of blow up opportunities until 2008 when I was well, but that early on, having somebody value the voice that I had, that scary sort of singing voice that I was able to express my resilience narrative, my abuse narrative through, to have that be seen was also really powerful and part of my journey. Not just that music heals, and I think music is a vehicle for conversation and for just personal growth, but the fact that I could connect with other people by way of this really scary, awful story, and then somehow have that produce money to make my life more stable. It was, you know, the fact that I was able to parlay my trauma into a career, essentially, has been really helpful. Again, retrospective, like looking back, that wasn't the plan, that's just what happened.
So you were actively struggling with addiction for 16 years?
Yes.
And what role did stigma play in preventing you from recovering sooner? Stigma,
right. Yeah, I think there was, in my early childhood, probably some stigma in the religious environment. Like, the reason nobody got me therapy and nobody got me help is because that wasn't on the table as an option for our family or for our community. And so I missed some opportunities for early healing there. I also, you know, early on when I was 14 and first started really experiencing depression, my parents took me to a therapist who was from our church. And in that session, he outed me, and he decided to ruin every relationship in your life. Is this your plan, to be homeless and awful to everyone and be sick and die? You know? And I remember feeling really offended, and I had a big response, like, of course I didn't decide this. Of course not. This isn't my life plan. You know, and he, in that sort of reverse psychology moment, connected me to what was happening. And he leaned in and said, what has happened to you? When did this start? And that started me on a process of healing. He connected me to the root of my suffering. I was able to take the work I did in that hospital and in that milieu of similarly struggling people and really change the way I thought about my history, change the way I thought about how I should be interacting with trauma. I identified that I was experiencing trauma and actually traumatizing myself over and over, and so it was like finally somebody interrupted that loop I was in.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like it was a combination of you being motivated like supremely motivated to recover.
I did not want to die.
No, and then also this trauma-informed mental health professional who met you right where you were, and that's a strategy, that technique he used is called slamming the door, where he gave you an opportunity to turn and walk, but instead it kept you in.
Totally. Well, and I presented suicidal, right? Like I tried to kill myself several times, the first time when I was 14, and it just proceeded to continue. And so it was this weird moment of realizing, I don't want to die. Why am I trying to kill myself? Like, why do I have this? And the reason I have that, the reason all people who are suicidal have that, I think, is not that we want to die, but we want the pain to stop. We want the trauma to not be behind the wheel. We want to live our lives ourselves instead of having our attacker sort of dictate our every move from here on out. And I think had someone given me that language early on, it would have spared me the better part of 2 decades.
So, your healing journey, as we're calling it.
Yeah, let's call it
the retrospective
Brandon.
Healing journey. And now here you are. You're a mental health advocate. You're the founder of Keep Oregon Well. How did you end up where you are today?
Yeah, so I, in 2008 when I got well, finally, all my problems didn't just suddenly disappear, surprisingly. I kind of thought like, oh, it's over, and it wasn't. In fact, it kind of got worse. I was able to suddenly feel my everyday, which I hadn't for most of my life. I was, feeling my history in a new way, but yet still very much feeling it. And I had also just gotten this major label deal and was supposed to be in bars every night, touring and playing songs about my suffering. It was just like terrible. And so my friend in 2010 got attacked downtown in a gay bashing, and I went to Q Center down the street to see if I could help, to see if I could be of use. I think my own suicidal ideation, my own being tethered to the world is a lot of the times reliant on a feeling of being useful or of mattering to the world or my environment or of plugging in a way that matters to people. And so I showed up at Q Center, I met Kendall Clausen. I needed to change my life. I needed to be somewhere new in a place where people cared about me and I could become a new person that didn't involve bars. And so I fired my band, I quit my label, I got into this really terrible situation with my publicists and everybody, and I just said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to cancel this tour right now in the middle of it, and I'm going to go work for a community center. And I did that, and that was what my heart needed, that was what my life needed. I needed to be around people who didn't want anything from me except for me to be well and happy and find community. And Kendall Clausen really did that for me. She gave me the opportunity to become who I might not have ever become had somebody not seen that in me. So that started me down the road of activism. I also was on MTV, right? I had this show on New Now Next. I was speaking to 26 million people every week. I think Kendall and a few other people really saw that and saw my huge network as being something we could use for the greater good, and showed me a pathway to do that. And from there, you know, I worked at Q Center doing PR for years and years. I also started writing music again then, and was able to find balance in my life for the first time. I met a woman named Laura Dellinger, who is president of Metropolitan Group, which is a social purpose advertising agency downtown. They were working on the Cover Oregon Obamacare rollout, and she asked if I would help. And so that was my first foray into public health. I was able to take this goofy, music career that meant nothing to me and overlay it on something that mattered. And suddenly it all mattered to me again. And I was able to lean into both. And that same person, Laura Dellinger, was at the time the chair of the Trillium Family Services Board of Directors. Trillium is Oregon's largest provider of mental and behavioral health care for children and families. And she came to me and asked if I would help create an advocacy platform for the organization. My first day in October of 2014, I went to a big community gathering with all sorts of legislative folks and community leaders, and the CEO of Trillium Group, Kim Scott, said at one point during the meeting, just kind of off the cuff, surely if we can have this whole culture around Keep Portland Here, we should be able to do the same thing around keeping Oregon well. And I was like, ha! That's it! That's the advocacy platform. And went and talked with the folks at Music Millennium about the branding and all of that. And we launched it. It started with t-shirts and me and Sheila telling our stories. Keep Oregon Well is a coming out movement. In my own life, I've seen real change happen in my family and the church I grew up in and my community from me just standing up and saying, hey, I'm Logan Lynn, this is who I am. And I figured the same science would apply if I stood up and said, hey, I'm Logan Lynn, this is who I am, but this is who I really am, like around mental and behavioral health care. I think it was really hard for me to stand up that first time and say, I feel suicidal still. Right? Like I'm living and I'm in a plan that's working, but I would still consider myself a person who experiences persistent suicidal ideation. My acting on that, my impulse control is managed, but that condition is still something I live with. And so I had a moment where I was like, okay, I'm creating this advocacy platform, this coming out movement. Who's going to go first? And it felt like I should go first. And so I started doing that. I wrote this record, Ju, last year about my own experience of healing, about resilience, around my own experience of loss and recovery. And we proceeded to do a tour and a press tour where I told that story thousands, hundreds if not thousands of times. It got to the point where I feel currently so comfortable saying it. And it before would have been something that I would have protected to know, like I would have never stopped protecting it. It was my deepest, darkest truth, that unless you had the pleasure of experiencing yourself at some point along the way, wasn't really widely known. I had acted really mentally ill for years on TV and on the radio and in my life, and I think people were always like, what is wrong with this guy? And so finally I had the opportunity to very publicly acknowledge what had happened to this guy. Thanks. And that, I think, inspired a lot of other people to do it. You know, we do the Keep Oregon Well Black and Gold Gala every year, where people who you might not expect stand and are counted, stand and tell their truth, and I feel really proud of that space we've created.
So I would love to know a little bit about how people can be involved in Keep Oregon Well.
Yeah. So right back there in the back of the room, there's the Keep Oregon Well street team signing people up for the pledge. If you go to keeporegonwell.com, you can take the pledge to fight stigma. It's all about trauma-informed narrative, equity and inclusion, social justice, and it's a mobilizing tool for communities to connect. I think that's the best starting place. And I guess for me, like I'm always inspired when people just tell me who they really are, right? Like that's the one thing that's been really unexpected, I think, from this, even though it was by design. I had hoped that would happen. But
leading by example.
Yeah, it opened the floodgates for people to also feel safe to tell their stories and feel celebrated, you know?
Great. Yeah, I mean, as a mental health therapist and spending not too long, but several years in the field, to encounter Keep Oregon Well, that really is about celebrating strength, how people stay strong and thrive in the face of adversity. It feels so different, right? The Mental Health Hero Awards, where in the month of May we celebrate a different community member every single day who's doing good work to fight the stigma associated with mental health. We need to be celebrated. We need to share those positive stories of growth and change, because I think that's how we can do more of it.
For sure.
So I want to thank you so much for sharing your story.
Yeah, of course.